Herzlichen Dank, Frau Vizepräsidentin.
Thank you, Vice President. So that brings us to our speakers. And our first speaker is Mr. Ferber for the European People's Party.
Vizepräsidentin, Frau Vizepräsidentin.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Dear colleagues, the FinCEN Files shows something that just a few months ago we discussed with Mr. Dubravka. Mrs. Šuica has mentioned that as well. And what has changed since then? Well, nothing. And I really regret, and it's something that I want to say right at the start, that the Council is not represented. Because where is the key problem? It's in the Member States. In the Member States, they're not able to implement what's decided here at European level. They can't implement that into legislation. And I think that the Commission should be taking these measures against Member States. The fifth anti-money laundering directive was brought in on the 1st of January 2020, before Corona, when we could do whatever we wanted. But only 17 countries have notified a full implementation. But I do hope the Commission is checking whether or not the implementation has actually been done. The other 9 have only partially implemented, and there's one, Cyprus, which hasn't even notified what they've done. And that is the problem that we have to deal with here in Europe. And then the second issue, and this isn't anything new either, it's something that we've already talked about. Financial supervisory authorities are not able to take adequate steps against companies. The solution by the banking authority was an emergency solution, but does need to be replaced with a lasting solution, an authority which can take measures, and money laundering needs to be a criminal offence, and we need to create the right conditions for that. We should say that money laundering has no place in Europe. We can only introduce limitations for the rest of the world, but they should follow the European example.
Thank you, Mr. Ferber. Our next speaker is from the group of the Socialists and Democrats, our colleague, Mr. Heinäluoma.
2,000 billion US dollars. This is almost twice the amount of the 7-year MFF and 3 times the value of the Recovery and Resilience Instrument. And at the same time, it's at least 30 times the Finnish annual budget. Suspicious activity reports which were recently leaked concerning transactions worth 2,000 billion US dollars. Banks must fill in one of these reports if they are worried one of its clients might be up to no good. The report is sent to the authorities, and despite these alarms, banks still often execute these transactions. And again, it's thanks to the great work of investigation journalists that this scandal is revealed. It demonstrates once again that the existing anti-money laundering system simply does not work. It is a Swiss cheese full of holes. Since a long time, my group has been calling for a uniform regulatory framework, an AML regulation. Regulatory clarity and certainty is needed for the public sector and for the industry. We also need stricter rules around rules on consumer due diligence and the beneficial ownership transparency. Stronger EU supervision is urgently needed too. Whether we need a new EU agency or extending the powers of the European Banking Authority is in a way less important as long as the job is done far much better than today. Therefore, the supervisor should get enough resources, staff and independence, and of course more EU supervision will only work provided there is a good cooperation with national competent authorities as they are on the ground. Supervising can only be done properly provided data around suspicious transactions flow easily cross-border. Therefore, we need an European Union Financial Intelligence Unit. Detecting and supervising suspicious cases is one thing, tackling and sanctioning is something else. I realise there is a very sensible field of crime enforcement and Member States like to keep control. Nonetheless, if we want to be serious in tackling AML, we need more deterring sanctions. Imposing big fines is all well and good, but I have not the impression that it changes fundamentally a culture. Here, a stronger role for Europol is really needed.
Vielen herzlichen Dank und es schließt sich an.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Strugario for the Renew Europe Group, please.
Thank you, Chair. 2,100 suspicious activity reports and more than 2 trillion in transactions. These are stunning numbers. The leaks reveal suspicious transactions at Deutsche Bank. Russian criminals and money launderers working for terrorist groups allegedly laundered money through the Moscow branch. The name of Vladimir Putin's cousin, Igor Putin, is also linked to such a transaction. Another leak reveals a transaction of 31 million between 2 offshore companies. The first one, with an account at Piraeus Bank, is owned by a person involved in arms trafficking for the Islamic State. And the other, with an account in the state-controlled Bulgarian Development Bank, is owned by a notorious Bulgarian arms dealer. All of this is happening under the eyes of the financial intelligence units, of the European banking authorities, of the ECB, of the law enforcement national authorities. Can I ask, how is it possible that we see money transferred, such impressive amounts of money transferred to safe places through the banking system? Basically, there is zero time to waste. And if we want to efficiently fight money laundering, we need full judicial cooperation in criminal matters. We need an AML regulation that we have been talking about for a long time. We need full transparency on beneficial ownership that we have been talking about for a long time. Cooperation with national authorities as well, but a truly functioning supervisory body. This is if we really want to fight money laundering. If not, it will never happen. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank, Frau Kollegin. Und es schließt.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Cruz for the Identity and Democracy Group, please. President, ladies and gentlemen, I think we all agree that money laundering needs to be dealt with, but we shouldn't be crying crocodile tears about how terrible this is. We have many rules which we've adopted. They're not being implemented, as everyone's saying. But I think what we have to do is not only look at the symptoms. That's not good enough. We shouldn't simply be trying to tackle money laundering. We have to try and move against what's behind money laundering, because it's only thus that we can deal with the problem. We need to tackle the crimes that lead to this dirty money. It's only when we've done that, when we've dealt with the greed that's producing these crimes, that's only when we'll be able to fight money laundering effectively. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Mr. Giegold for the Greens, please.
Präsidentin, liebe Kolleginnen.
Thank you, colleagues. The FinCEN Files have a surprising positive side effect, because now we know what the American FinCEN is. This type of authority, like the American FinCEN, is something that we need urgently in Europe. Now, it's true that we didn't really pay attention to some of the data, but it now has a positive effect for the debate globally about money laundering. The American FinCEN is an investigative authority that looks at transactions within the US and worldwide, and the reason why some of the dirtiest banks, ABLV or banks in Cyprus, are coming under pressure is not because the European Commission or European national authorities have detected this, but because the FinCEN has carried out very strict investigations and put its finger on the wound and introduced or threatened to introduce sanctions against Latvia and Cyprus, whereas the Commission has observed without acting. The American FinCEN looks at things for the whole of America, looks at all of the notifications. There aren't 51 separate FIUs. there's one common authority, and this is something that we talked about on a cross-group basis, and an authority like this Commission is exactly what we're expecting, an authority that can intervene, an authority that carries out joint investigations, and unfortunately that's not in your action plan. You talk about a money laundering authority, but you don't talk about a central financial investigation unit, an FIU. A subsidiarity principle would mean that we need one financial investigation unit so that we can be at par with the US. And I have a question. I think it is good that questionnaires have been sent out to some member states with regard to the implementation. Can you tell us here exactly which member states you got in touch with? And secondly, when will you be starting infringement proceedings against the member states that since 2007 are violating money laundering legislation? Thank you very much, Mr. Giegold. And the next speaking is Mr. Busade Villaba.
Thank you, President. The massive leak of the U.S. agency FinCEN has showed how the Maduro government has been carrying out crimes and made fortunes while stealing from his own country and trafficking drugs. Some countries, such as Spain, have wound up financing communist and mafia-like governments who intend to put an end to the social order, even though yesterday we were told in this chamber that Mr. Maduro is as good as Snow White. Money laundering stemming from those illicit activities affects us. Colleagues, we cannot allow these narco dictatorships to do as they wish right under our noses while conniving with European banks or using tax havens such as Gibraltar, an infamous colony that has been used for money laundering for illicit activities for a long time. We have millions of Europeans who are unemployed. We have many families who are suffering, and it is simply obscene that instead of fighting tooth and nail against money laundering, drug trafficking and terrorism, we are spending millions coming from European taxpayers to finance the multinational globalist companies' party. We should be doing better. Thank you, President.
Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for the groups for the GUE is Mrs. Aubry. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Well, this is a story of large banks, large fortunes and tax havens who think they're above the law. This is the FinCEN Files, a scandal, and we're talking about millions and millions of transactions, each one worse than the other. Money laundering, tax avoidance, tax evasion. We all know this story off by heart. It's constantly repeated. Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, Swiss leaks. It's an endless list. The work of investigative journalists revealed this scandal, and it's not simply a one-off. This is a planned system. The large banks, first and foremost, HSBC, UBS, etc. And then tax havens, it's always the same ones, the Cayman Islands, the Virgin Islands, Cyprus, etc. And European finance ministers have done nothing to try and deal with that, apart from this week withdraw the Cayman Islands from the list of tax havens, as if the Cayman Islands hadn't been involved in all the financial scandals of recent years. And then what about Cyprus and Ireland? I mean, your pseudo-blacklist is simply useless. So for how long are we going to have to put up with the crocodile tears of our leaders without them actually doing anything to deal with the situation? Our citizens can no longer put up with these financial crimes while they pay for the costs of the crisis. We need to go and find the money where it's hidden.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Ferrara. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. organized crime, tax evasion, terrorists, and very powerful people in the political world. They move huge amounts of money and use the dark side of the global financial system. According to the FinCEN Files, thanks to tax havens and offshore companies and the cooperation of the largest banks in the world, many of these operating in Europe, this has all been possible. In the EU, we have the 6th anti-money laundering directive, and yet there is still a lot to do with the sector legislation, as well as screening and monitoring, cooperation with regulating authorities, so that we can efficiently fight against the phenomenon that continues to move forward. Banks should not be able to profit from this, especially if they make more money than the sanctions they'll have to face. We cannot allow these criminal activities to feed economic inequalities, distort the market, and steal resources that should be used by our citizens. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Und wir
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mr. Karas. You have the floor. Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, the FinCEN files are yet another example of how deep the problem of money laundering and financial corruption is, and we need to act together. The fight against money laundering, corruption and criminality is only something that we can achieve together, both at global and European level. And 2 trillion euros, that's approximately 5% of global GDP. But here in the EU, it's 110 billion. That's very similar to the budget for the EU. And citizens are quite rightly asking, how many revelations does it need? These criminal networks need to have the tap shut off. It's shocking. There's a contradiction between the rules and the implementation. And the 4th and 5th AML regulations haven't been implemented yet. And we need more investigation. We need a common European approach. We need a directive instead of just guidelines. Maybe we need an authority, financial investigation teams. Ladies and gentlemen, let's do at European level what we need to do. Thank you very much, Mr. Karas. And the next speaker will be Mr. Tang.
Like Manon said, this is not the first time. We had LuxLeaks, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, and I agree with Sven Giegold. Transparency is a wonderful thing, but let's face it, this story has been told 1,000 times. We in this room know it. Ordinary people are still confused, and by the tools that are used, usually they don't have trust in Jersey, a Swiss bank account, or a shell company in the Netherlands, and they don't get it. But we must realize, and certainly the people that are aware, that this is used mainly by the rich. The terrorists, the criminals, the rich, they own the hidden wealth in the world, half of the hidden wealth according to calculations by economists. And it's not even the 1% that owns the hidden wealth in offshore jurisdictions. It's the 1% of the 1% that own half of the hidden wealth in the world. And it is very clear from the FinCEN files that action needs to be taken, and that not enough action has been taken so far. Because now bankers blindly forward transactions to the financial investigation units, only to find out later they have facilitated fraudulent transactions. And these FIUs, on the other hand, are flooded with information but lack the means and resources to keep up. And if transactions are found to breach law, which if transactions are investigations, the money has long been gone. Take former President Yanukovych, who was able to transport billions out of Ukraine. Or take former President's daughter, Isabel dos Santos, by now the richest woman in Africa. She's spending her day also in luxury, not in Angola, but in Russia and other places. So what we need is to staff and strengthen the FIUs, And of course, FIUs need to exchange information or close cooperation. But in addition, we need to make banks act upon their role as gatekeepers. Forwarding alone is not enough. Banks need to know their customers, and when suspicious activity is found, press pause. The point is, of course, making private actors fulfill public goals is hard. It cannot be done without clear rules, strict oversight, and very tough penalties. We need to work on that now so that we avoid that former dictators can spend their days in luxury. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker will be Mr. Boyer.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. Well, obviously, as we've recalled, scandals such as this one undermine citizens' trust in our financial and tax systems, and we can react as we have done this morning. But first and foremost, we need to respond to this feeling of injustice and lack of clarity when it comes to taxation in the world and also sometimes in the European Union. We'll all be judged on what we do, and we'll also be judged on what we don't do. The Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. We recently sent out a strong political signal by setting up a subcommittee that deals with these specific issues as part of our Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. And the idea is to ensure that everyone pays tax where they owe it and where they should. And you can count on our support for the fiscal package from the Commission, which we hope is a strong one, and you can count on our support to try and get public opinion to put pressure on the Council with regard to files that are blocked. Business taxes, for example, it's been blocked for years. And you can also count on us to put pressure on the Council to do away with the rule of unanimity when it comes to fiscal matters, which is obviously called...
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mr. Madison.
Ja, suur aitäh. See on väga huvitav teema.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting subject. I am very well aware of this subject because my home party is in the government in Estonia, and the chair of our party is the Minister of Finance. In 2005 to 2014, huge money laundering took place in Estonia, which was organized through the Estonian branch of Danske Bank, and Russian money flew to the Western Europe. But I don't agree with the solution offered here. The Commission and majority of the Parliament demand the establishment of a new institution, more bureaucracy, more competence to the EU and less competence to the Member States. But I know, on the example of our own country, if there is political will, it is possible to investigate money laundering criminal offences. We have strengthened the criminal law, we have established new duties for the banks, and all of this without great help from the European Commission or any political pressure. So thank you very much for offering to help fighting with money laundering, but we politely refuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mrs. Bricmont.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. 2013 with offshore leaks, 2020 with FinCEN, and we've had Swiss leaks, banana papers, Dubai papers, and it's all thanks to whistleblowers and journalists that have allowed us to uncover these criminal activities, and I'd like to pay tribute to them today. Their work has helped this Parliament for years so that mafias, oligarchs, despots, drug barons stop pillaging our collective resources unscrupulously, such as Deutsche Bank and LG, which are mentioned in the FinCEN Files. After the COVID crisis, how can you explain that 10 billion euros of money have been funneled through all of these companies, public money that is? We need to sound an alarm. Banks need to live up to their anti-money laundering requirements, and the public expect this. Once and for all, we need to ensure that European legislation is upheld. We need to fight against the abuse of banks by criminal activities, and we need to ensure that the heads of these banks face sanctions. We're going to set up a European monitoring facility that will allow us to fight on behalf of the Union in order to ensure our fight against financial crimes so that we can combat these financial crimes efficiently. Remember that behind these crimes there are also thousands of victims of drug trafficking, corruption, terrorism, armed conflicts, all of these activities which are financed by dirty money which circulates thanks to the banks. So the rights of victims need to be ensured, and we need to keep them in mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Kemper. You have the floor.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for giving me the floor on this debate. Now, I'm from Poland, and I'd invite you to visit Poland, because Poland is often mentioned because it doesn't respect the rule of law, but it's actually in Poland where we very effectively deal with these criminals who use our banks and launder dirty money. Pretty much every month, public opinion is informed of an arrest and convictions that obtained against these criminals. We need to have effective tools to do that. Prosecutors need to have effective tools. In Poland, it's Minister Ziobro who is responsible for these activities. Large-scale bankers who have connections at the international level and who work for dirty banks. Well, that's what we're trying to deal with here. But we shouldn't be just talking about fighting them. We actually need the tools necessary.
Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mr. Gusmao. Thank you very much. The European Commission has shed crocodile tears here in the same week in which it removed the Cayman Islands from the blacklist. I mean, it's such a short list that you could get the impression that all of the jurisdictions in Europe are cooperative, but that's not the case. We see scandal after scandal, and the only thing that's being done is by journalists. It's only whistleblowers and journalists who are pointing out that there are scandals, and here we need to address the banks, because these are European banks, banks in Cyprus, France, Germany, and they are the ones that have committed these crimes. And what's going to happen with these European banks? What's going to happen with the member states that are really very high on the list of countries protecting these banks? The Commission says that they're going to be calling people to account. But we hear this from the Commission, but the Commission just delays and delays. And thank you very much. And the next speaker will be Mr. Sinčić.
Thank you. We in Croatia also have problems with money laundering. Recently, the scandal with Zagrebačka banka was discovered. There was a large amount of money involved. 3 members of the board of directors had to resign. The central bank had to control it, but it hid it and maybe even participated in it. So what did Croatian citizens in Europe see of that money while they laundering billions? We have millions of poor people. In Croatia only we have more than 200,000 children, poor children who are poor. Poor children develop more slowly, they learn less, and they have a huge chance of being poor one day themselves. We can use this chance to move this wealth from those banks and give it to people who really need it. We should give those people a chance, give those children a chance. This is not only an economic issue, but also a moral and civic issue in the 21st.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker will be Mr. Kaza.
Thank you, President. Once again, we've seen these leaked documents linked to organized crime. The FinCEN leaks are different from the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers because these 1,500 documents do not speak about specific cases of money laundering carried out by one company or one person. No, in these documents we see a clear picture of what's happening throughout the world and how large and wide-ranging criminal activity is and how banks are part of this. Banks allow the flow of dirty money from organized crimes. They face difficulties in the US, but also in Europe. This is why we need to have clear rules to prevent these practices. While we cannot make it difficult for honest businesses to carry out banking transactions, while criminals abuse the banking system to the detriment of honest citizens. We need to identify these money laundering crimes, and we need to make sure we bring these people to justice. We need stronger FIUs, and we also need a regulation at the European level against money laundering. I call on you to do this as soon as possible so that we can bring these criminals to justice. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much, Mr. Casa. The next speaker will be Mr. Fernandez.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Another debate on additional scandals that relate to money laundering. We've been doing this for far too long, and we all agree, we all want to do away with money laundering, but what we do is work via directives which member states interpret in different ways and sometimes don't even implement. We have national supervisory authorities who are incapable of monitoring in a globalized market where money flows around the world. And then we have tax havens, and we don't really know the criteria for which the Cayman Islands and others are on or off our lists. We need a single European financial intelligence unit, we need a single investigative authority, and we need to ensure that we know a lot more about whether...
Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mr. Kovarik.
Madam Vice President, the FinCEN files show clearly the sheer quantity of suspicious transactions taking place in US dollars across the globe, including the EU. And it's no different if you consider transactions in euros or other currencies in the EU. This highlights the need for better global cooperation. FinCEN case also demonstrates that reporting works, because reports are filed in the first place. However, what happens after these are reported, this is what truly matters. Do the authorities adequately check and, if necessary, investigate activities? In the EU, Europol reported, for instance, that there were 1 million STRs in 2014. Of these, only 10% were further investigated, and only 1% of the money reported as suspicious was recovered. This was not a one-off. This is indeed a trend, repeating itself since early 2000s. So clearly, we are missing a link. We need a better supervision and information sharing, not just between national, European and international authorities, but also between banks and, importantly, within banking groups. I believe that one of these missing links could be a more generalized use of regulatory and supervisory technologies, based, for instance, on AI for processing transactions. This could significantly improve the compliance with regulations, identify suspicious activities faster and more efficiently, and also signal it to relevant authorities. So yes, let's strengthen our regulatory framework, but let's also beef up the authorities so that they are able to have an efficient fight against money laundering in Europe. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mr. Kofod.
Tak for det, formand.
Thank you, Chair. This really is an important subject. Money laundering leads to terrorism, organized crime, other types of crime. So it is really important that we take this seriously and we get better at fighting money laundering. Now, I don't think it's just a question of more regulation at the EU level. I think, rather, that we should apply the legislation we already have. We should get better at reporting suspicious transactions, inform each other, help each other in the investigation, regardless of your big ambitions. Well, the power to do it is with the member countries. So let's stop giving beautiful speeches, but start using the legislation we have to fight this type of crime. Thank you.
Damit kommen wir in der Aussprache zu Herrn Kollegen Grüfer.
Thank you. Mr. Grufa is the next speaker. You have the floor. Thank you. Colleagues, LuxLeaks, Panama Papers, FinCEN, scandal after scandal. And we see that Europe and the member states are still finding good reasons to not upset the big banks. Financial crimes are a lucrative business, which is scandalous in the current economic climate and given the crisis we're facing. Where is the European political courage, which was supposed to protect taxpayers and the real economy from financial abuse? The FinCEN scandal shows the knowing involvement of big banks in money laundering, and there must be consequences. How can we be asking citizens to behave correctly when we let big finance act like hooligans without any sanctions? We need ambitious reform of the European financial system. The Commission must implement rules which set a framework for big banks in their strategies. All of the illegal financial transactions which penalise our economies and undermine our European founding principles must be sanctioned. I call upon you to impose real oversight and dissuasive sanctions in line with the damage being caused. We should not be granting banks the right to commit fraud just as we grant companies a right to pollute. And thank you very much. And the next speaker will be Mr. Willemsen.
Storkriminelle.
Offenders of the largest kind, drug traffickers, terrorists, they've all been infiltrating our financial system. That's nothing new. But with the FinCEN Files, we get names to put to these different types. This has hit the biggest bank of all in Denmark, Danske Bank. By not regulating or supervising banks enough during the recent decades, it's been far too easy for the banks. We need to be more regulated now. We need better control with public banks. When the EU removes the Cayman Islands from the list of paradises, tax havens, well, then the EU is only weakening our fight against money laundering. Money laundering and tax havens have to be fought. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Marques, please.
Muito obrigado, Senhora Presidente. Uma vez mais.
Thank you, President. Once again, this scandal of illegal money transfers throughout the world to evade capital controls and escape sanctions, always in the dark and always while evading taxes, has happened. Year after year, we need to ensure that all of these rules are applied in all member states, and member states need resources to be able to act. This is a cross-border problem, which is why national sanctions are not enough. We don't need actions such as the Council removing the Cayman Islands from the list of tax havens. What we need is stronger enforcement in non-cooperating countries. We cannot allow the world to use that these tax havens